Hello, and you're very welcome to episode 76 of The Fifth Court, a podcast on legal affairs presented by myself, Peter Leonard, barrister and mediator.
And myself, Mark Tottenham, barrister and editor of Decisive Law Reports.
Well, Mark, as you will recall, we broadcast our live interview with Joe Brolly, recorded at the Solicitors Growth Conference in Naas last month, and we did our level best to keep him on legal themes, I think.
I think we...
Did we succeed?
To a certain extent,
little bit of sport, little bit of history.
You got an email in from somebody called Mickey Hart, didn't you, about what we said?
I think Mickey Hart has more to be doing. I think he's going to focus on getting Derry and All-Ireland
you don't think he listens to the Fifth Court every week?
Of course he listens. Everybody listens to the Fifth Court, absolutely. And can I just say our huge thanks again to Flor McCarthy, Martin Lawler and Catherine Tobin for looking after us and for running such a brilliant conference.
Absolutely.
Which was a joy to be part of. Well, this evening we are returning to the Law Library in Dublin and are delighted to welcome Barrister Barry Ward, who is also a Fine Gael member of the Seanad. Barry served for more than a decade on Dunleary Rapdown County Council, and with the local elections looming, we've asked Barry to come in to discuss the role of county councillors and what powers they have. Mark, you in particular thought this was very important.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've always felt coming up to elections, very often you find people in their election literature talking about things that aren't necessarily what they're going to be doing when they're in office. So I thought it's very important to, investigate what the actual powers of a local authority member are.
Yeah.
And then Barry, being both a lawyer and an experienced county councillor, I thought.
Yeah, he's brilliant. And I think Barry has great respect for county councillors, but I think he thinks that they're some of the most hardworking public officials out there. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what he has to say about all of this. But first to three cases that you have identified from the Decisive website. We're going to start this evening with a tax compliance, or rather non-compliance case. In this case, a revenue officer applied for a civil penalty in respect of a non-compliant taxpayer. The taxpayer, however, raised a number of objections and sought to cross-examine the revenue official. So the taxpayer wanted answers.
Yeah.
This is the case of Dooner versus Fahy, and it's a decision of Mr. Justice Conor Dignam.
Yeah, so this is a civil claim by the revenue officer. So basically, the revenue has obviously two options. They can either seek to bring criminal proceedings against a taxpayer who hasn't paid their tax, or they can simply get a civil penalty, or they call it a civil penalty. So this is in respect of various taxes. And what happened here was basically the person it had been established that they were non-compliant, but they sought to cross-examine the revenue official on what was otherwise a case to be heard on affidavit or on paper. And that application went before Mr. Justice Dignam. And Mr. Justice Dignam basically said, look, this person is trying to delay proceedings. He hasn't established that there is any real issue that needs to be cross-examined, and so he threw out that application.
Okay, well, I'm not surprised. I kind of love that notion of, no, I'm not going to answer the questions. I'm going to ask you the questions instead. That's the way, the best form of defence is attack, Mark. Isn't that what they say? Okay, well, next to our personal injuries case, and this was against a local authority. In this case, a plaintiff claimed to have suffered an injury when she tripped over a tree root on a public footpath. Oh, I'm very interested to hear how this one goes. Did she succeed, Mark? You're going to have to tell us. This is the case of Best versus Dublin South County Council, and it's a decision of Mr. Justice Micheál O'Higgins.
Yeah, so this is a claim by somebody who fell on a public footpath quite late at night, and she brought a claim against the local authority, claiming that she had been caused to trip by a crack in the pavement that was caused by a tree root. And obviously we'd all be familiar with seeing where tree roots have kind of lifted up a paving stone. The problem in this case was, because it was late at night, she had clearly been kind of in shock after the fall, but she couldn't really satisfy the court that she had tripped over this particular particular crack, that she wasn't very clear. And also she gave evidence that there would be three other people with her at the time of the fall, and none of them gave evidence. So the court wasn't given any corroboration as to where the fall had taken place. So
so this is a little bit unsatisfactory. I thought he was going to say, what role would a tree root pushing up a public footpath, what impact would that have?
Didn't even get that far.
No, didn't get to that stage. Well, so maybe we'll hear that down the line because, really the tree can't help it, can it?
Certainly can.
Okay. Well, the third case this evening that concerns the powers of the Charities Regulatory Authority. Are they entitled to demand documentation from a company secretary without notice? And was this a criminal offence to fail to provide these documents? So this is kind of a serious bit of business. The CRA Tell us about that one, Mark. I should say that this is the case of the Charities Regulatory Authority versus Leonard, and it's a decision of Ms. Justice Hyland.
Yeah, so the Charities Regulatory Authority have basically assumed the power that was previously vested in the Attorney General to regulate charities. And like a lot of these kind of statutory supervisory bodies, they have quite extensive powers to demand documentation. And what seems to have happened here is that they arrived at the premises of this particular organisation, they demanded documentation, and that was not that was not forthcoming. And so they then prosecuted in the district court, where the district court said, oh, well, you should have given proper notice before arriving at the premises to demand the documents. That then went by case data to the High Court, and the High Court said no, under the powers of the Charities Regulatory Authority, they can make these demands, and it is a criminal offence not to provide the documentation.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, back shortly with Barry Ward. Clio, the most recommended cloud-based legal software used by 150,000 lawyers worldwide. Want to streamline case management, automate tasks including your client intake process and billing, while supported by a team of people 24/5. Visit clio.com/IE.
Silence in the Fifth Court.
So we are very pleased to be joined in the studio today by Senator Barry Ward, who will be known to many people in the law and beyond. He has been a senator since the last election in 2020. I'm losing track of the decades at this stage. Formerly a county councillor, which is why we are here to speak to him, because we're going to discuss the powers of county councillors. And back in the day was the auditor of the LNH. So Barry, tell us a little bit about what got you into politics, and did it go side by side with your career in the law, or did you did one of them come first?
It's funny actually, because I remember when I ran in 2009 for the council for the first time, I was interviewed by Dermot MacDonald in the Independent about how I got involved, and I did recount the story in my mind of how I got involved. It was to do with an ice rink that was being put in a park in Williamstown and Booterstown, and my aunt, who lived in Booterstown Avenue, was very concerned about it and asked me to come and talk to the Residents Association, because the local St Mary's Boys National School there in Grotto Place in Booterstown used that bit of the park for their football field, and they were very upset. And so I worked with the Residents Association, got absolutely nowhere. But the experience I had was I was really astonished by how little the council officials cared about what local residents thought. And some of the people in the Residents Association suggested I should run, and then I was a member of Fine Gael, and I was approached to run in Blackrock, and I ran and all the rest. And I told her this story, and that was grand. And a friend of mine who was in college with me rang me up and said, that was a good old yarn, wasn't it? I said, what are you talking about? He goes, I remember talking to you in college about running for office. I have no recollection of it, but I did do politics in UCD. I have always been interested in politics. I worked for Enda Kenny as his legal advisor from 2005 to 2007 before going down to the bar. So it wasn't a surprising transition for me, but I don't remember that now, being honest. But I'd always mentioned.
You studied politics first and then went to the King's Inns?
Yeah, I never intended to be a lawyer, actually. I'm kind of an accidental barrister. I did other things. I did postgraduate studies in finance and worked as a financial advisor for a while, and actually qualified as a bus driver as well, and was going to be a bus driver even after I did the King's Inns, but worked for Enda Kenny as his legal advisor, which was a fascinating job in Leinster House from 2005. So in the run-up to the 2007 general election, and there were kind of three strands to that job. One was policy, one was dealing with legal issues in his office, and then there was a lot of kind of draftsmanship and legal drafting within the office as well.
Mark, I have to jump in. I mean, working with Enda Kenny is interesting, but driving a bus? That's very interesting. Barry, come on, you got to tell us more.
I'll tell you what, I was working in a public affairs company called Fleischman Hillard before I went to Enda's office, and I was doing King's Inns while I was working there, and I kind of decided while I was coming up to qualifying as a barrister that I didn't want to stay in public affairs and was going to take 2 years out, and went and did my licence as a bus driver and got a job with an Australian coach touring company, and I was due to start work with them.
Contiki or something.
It was Contiki as it happens,
okay.
yeah. And everybody was under 35, and it sounded like a bit of fun for a while. I was going to do that for maybe a year, and then I was approached by two members of the Fine Gael Parliamentary Party with whom I had worked in my public affairs capacity, and they said there was this job opening up in Enda's office. I was only his second legal advisor, actually, and they asked me to apply, and I applied for that job, kind of thinking I'd give it a go, and I got that job, and then that was the end of the bus driving career. So
wow, there you go.
And that was when Fine Gael was at a fairly low ebb. I seem to remember 2002 they did very badly.
2002
so you were really
dark days, all right. Yeah,
okay.
We had a real drubbing at that general election, and Enda Kenny then took over as leader after that election and really did build up the party from the bottom. And he did an extraordinary amount of work going all around the country. I remember you'd be talking to him in the morning and he'd be in Letterkenny, and then you'd be talking to him in the afternoon. He was in Rosslare, and then he'd be back in the office that evening, and just an extraordinary work rate. But he did.
It really seems to be necessary in politics to have that kind of energy. And
I think so.
And I assume he really enjoyed that kind of thing. I mean, you just wouldn't give it that level of
exactly. I think he fundamentally liked people and liked talking to people and meeting to people. And I know he gets stick for I met a man from Castlebar and he had whatever in one hand and had whatever in the other hand. But that is Enda. It's not shtick. It's not something he makes up. It is his daily experience, and it's what he listens to, and what people said to him. He took that back and he turned it into policy. And I think it's the essence of politics, is actually listening to people, listening to what the issues are, listening to what you can possibly do to help them with that. And Enda that was fundamentally him. He was a people person.
Okay. So this brings us nicely then to your own listening to people. You were a county councillor from 2009.
Yeah.
Was it a surprise once you got in there? Did you feel that you'd be able to kind of change the Dunleary,
as I said,
Rathdown County
my
Council
experience
area?
initially was that I was kind of surprised by how little the council had any regard to what local residents thought. And I did think that as a councillor, you would have a greater influence on what they did. And the reality is the power base is with the officials, not with the elected people. But even then, I had no understanding going in of how slowly the wheels turn in terms of resolving issues that you bring to the officials, that you bring to the council. You might get a motion passed on something. It doesn't necessarily mean anything will happen. And what I took time to learn over years was how to make things happen. And that is to find the right official, to get them on board, to get them into it, and to get them essentially to drive the project behind the scenes.
I mean, I want to come back generally to the powers, but I mean, when you talk about knowing the right people, I mean, surely as you say, the motions, the actual decisions that are made collectively by the county councillors ought to be the most important work for them. I mean, that's what you're elected to do. Everything else is what I think we used to call clientelism. I mean, if you're simply knocking on people's doors and having words in people's ears, that's not really what you're elected to do, is it?
I think it is, actually. I think you're elected to listen. You're elected to be in touch with the people, because the funny thing is, as much as the power disparity exists between the elected people and the appointed people, being the officials, the reality is that the county manager, as it then was, now chief executive of local authorities, never knocks on your door and asks you what you think. That happens with your councillor. Your councillor is the one who will always answer the phone when you ring. Your councillor is the one who is in your local area. Your councillor is the one who is actually accountable to you insofar as you can choose not to vote for them at the next election. That is not true of any of the officials in the council. And so I know you're going to come back to it, but that is the major democratic deficit that exists at local level, to my mind, is the fact that the power doesn't rest with the people who are actually there to exercise the democratic will of the people.
Barry, I agree with you completely. I think people underestimate the power of county councillors. And I think it was instructive all those years ago. Your colleague, Michael Ring, the legend from the West, do you remember he took that High Court case when, you weren't allowed to have the dual mandate, TD and sitting on the local authority. And he said, no, that's where I need to be. Because he was somebody who did a lot of work for his constituents. I think everybody knows that. We're not getting into party politics here, but I think we know that. And he felt that he was being denied that opportunity because you have that closeness with the county manager and, you can have that relationship that can be incredibly effective.
Yeah, I must say I don't agree with Michael on this. I do agree with what he's saying, and I agree with the proximity point. You need to be close to the officials, you need to be on the ground, but the job of a member of the Oireachtas is different than the job of a member of local authority. And I do support the idea that there wouldn't be a dual mandate. And there were lots of members of the Oireachtas who didn't, even when they were allowed to, didn't have the benefit of also being a councillor, who still did a good job. The whole idea behind that change in the early 2000s was that you would try to take that clientelism that you're talking about, Mark, to try to take that out of politics and to allow councillors to fill that
But
position.
I suppose the point being that a kind of an eminent TD still wanted to be a councillor because a councillor can have a huge impact.
And
that's the point.
No one in the Dáil who understands the importance of being close to people locally like Michael Ring does.
I had the pleasure there 2 weeks ago of going to a pub quiz in Parnell Square in the Teachers Club. And of course, in the best tradition of these things, I had to go for a drink beforehand. So we went wandering around and I said, Conway's still open. It's not. And the reason I bring that up is because legendarily, back in the day, if that's a word, that was where Dublin County Council, they used to meet at the top of O'Connell Street and then round the corner to Conway own ways. And that's really where the country was run for a long time, with county councillors. Isn't that the case?
And certain
city councillors,
certain paper bags were passed from one person to another.
But the point being that the powers have changed. But I'm just saying, back in the day, I mean, again, councillors could be very influential in terms of that sort of stuff.
As you say, powers have fundamentally changed, and they've changed for an obvious reason, and it's because of that kind of thing. Powers were misused in the, I suppose, certainly 90s, but probably 80s, 70s, going back further as well. Councillors did have more power. Local government was very different. Local government was fundamentally reorganised with the Local Government Act 2001, and the Planning and Development Act 2000, I think, is the beginning of the significant and unfortunate diminution of powers of locally elected councillors. So in the 90s, we know of all the planning scandals and all the powers that were abused by councillors, particularly in the Dublin area. And you have a situation where government decided, understandably and probably correctly, to take those planning powers away from councillors. But it was the start of a 25-year period up to today where councillors have been stripped of powers that are hugely important and which have created this democratic deficit at local level.
This brings us nicely to the reason we wanted to talk to you today, which is that the local elections are coming up. When people see people's faces on posters and they hear all sorts of promises, surely it's important for them to understand exactly what the actual power of their county councillor is. And what is the actual power of a county councillor? I mean, does it depend on each individual area of legislation, or is there a general overreaching power?
I'm sorry to say that I think the powers of councillors are limited. They have much more soft power than they do actual written down statutory power. And all local government powers are divided into reserve powers and executive functions. So reserve powers are the ones that are reserved for the sole discretion of the elected members. They number about a dozen. And then the executive powers is everything else, which is the vast majority of things. So I feel very strongly that councillors, who are, I think, without fear of being contradicted, they are the hardest working politicians. They are the people who work at every level, who are hugely important, but who have no resources. They don't get support staff. They don't get resources really in terms of how to deal with the hundreds of emails they all receive every week. And they have to do it all on their own.
Can you give us an example of what the reserved powers are?
Yeah, reserve powers, the biggest one is the budget. So councillors pass the budget every year and they agree the budget, but even that power has been diminished. Right. So, for example, the budgetary process now is significantly changed, and the budget is actually drawn up in the first instance by the chief executive and is then brought to what's called the CPG, the Corporate Policy Group, which is like the cabinet, if you like, of the council insofar as you can stretch that metaphor to that point. It is the chairs of the various strategic policy committees, 5 or 6 of them, plus the Cathaoirleach, plus the county, the chief executive of the authority, the local authority. And she or he, in the case of the chief executive, brings the budget to that group for approval. But so much, like a minister for education, so much of the budget is already tied up with salaries and wages and things like that there's little enough that can be changed. And of course, once the thing is brought to the table, chief executive says, we're going to spend X amount of money in this column. And if the councillors then say, well, actually, we want to spend more money over here, the chief executive's first question is going to be, well, where are you taking it from? So what are you going to cut to do what you want there? So you're already starting with the deck stacked against the elected members. And this is where the learning and the experience comes in, because what you need to do, therefore, is you need to get the ear of the chief executive or the relevant director of services, because the budget is divided by division. So you will have housing, you will have planning, you will have roads, all that kind of thing. You need to get that director of services to fight for the little line that you want in the budget to get the particular road resurfacing or planting that you want, whatever it might be that you want done.
But this goes back to the word in the ear. I mean, why would a director of services necessarily listen to an elected local councillor more than a lobbyist or some other person who's going to bend their ear? I mean, surely the purpose of the councillors is to pass resolutions and make collective decisions. And you're effectively saying that power is almost worthless. You're better off having a word in their office.
Yeah, and you can pass resolutions, but ultimately they're essentially non-binding on the executive, the officials. In fairness, the vast majority of officials, I think, want to do the right thing. The problem is when you have a difference in perception between the elected person and the official as to what is the right thing to do. And that's where managing relationships is important. But there's got to be give and take. And so, for example, councillors can make life difficult for the officials as well. And so, particularly when you're part of a larger group of councillors, you have the power to actually get momentum behind something the executive want to do or against something the executive want to do. And ultimately, most things have to be actually approved by the councillors. But the problem that I suppose I see is that when they come to the council, they're fully formed ideas, and it's very difficult to tinker with them or to amend them in a way that substantially changes them. So it's up to councillors to, in most cases, vote them through or vote them down.
Okay. And Barry, can I ask you just about the structure of the county council? Now, you were a very eminent member of Dunleary Rathdown Council for about 11 years, am I right? You up till 2020
right,
when you joined the Seanad. So, like, you've seen it all and you've been there. In terms of the number of councillors, I mean, there is, up to 40 councillors, at about 35 to 40 on Dunleary Rathdown?
Dunleary Rathdown has 40. Each
40,
of the Dublin
okay.
county councils 40, but Dublin City has 63.
Okay, and like that's a lot of people, isn't it?
Too many.
That's a lot of personalities vying for a bit of attention, trying to get a word in the official's ear. I mean, the poor old official with so many people chasing after them. And also, when I found, because I had a little go back in the year of our Lord 2014, 10 years ago, in the Dundrum area. And what struck me at the time was kind of the regional nature of county councils. I mean, I presume if you're in Kerry, it's slightly different if you're in North Kerry to South Kerry, etc., etc. And there's different interest groups. And likewise, in somewhere like Dunleary Rathdown, the issues for Dundrum might be different to those for people living in Dunleary.
Yeah.
So how does all of that work?
Well, one of the big differences between Kerry and Dunleary Rathdown is that at least in Kerry they have what are called municipal districts. So in 2014, the Local Government Reform Act abolished town councils on the one hand, but also created municipal districts to replace them. So you would have Killarney Municipal District, you'll have Tralee Municipal District. Because there were no town councils in Dublin, except in Balbriggan, there are no municipal districts in Dublin. And municipal districts are important because they allow a smaller group within the council to make decisions. So the full council can delegate to the municipal council, the municipal district council, the decision-making power in relation to certain budgetary decisions or whatever it might be. So it means the councillors for Killarney can decide what they're going to do with Main Street or New Street or whatever it is in Killarney. We can't do that in Dunleary Rathdown. So you're quite right. If you're in Dundrum or Dunleary or Dalkey or Clonskeagh, the issues that affect you are different. But every decision that has to be approved by council has to be approved by the full council. And it's one of the things I've actually been trying to change with the various ministers for local government is to put municipal districts into urban local authorities. So there are 6 that don't have them, the 4 in Dublin, plus Cork and Galway city councils. And that's a hindrance to decision-making powers. But again, most local authorities are divided along geographic areas. So taking Dunleary Rathdown, which is my own experience, we divide it in half, really. We talk about the Dundrum side and the Dunleary side. They largely reflect the Dublin Rathdown and Dunleary Dáil constituencies. And in each of them, you have 3 local electoral areas and you have 21 and 19 councillors respectively. But there will be a different engineer for each of those areas. There'll be different area meetings to deal with the issues for both
different
those
budgets.
areas. Different budgets to an extent. Again, the full council budget has to be approved by the full council. But yes, each line within the budget, there will be a different allocation for each of them on some things. So roads, for example, housing, that kind of thing, but not everything.
Okay, brilliantly explained. Mark, just one other question I want to ask Barry. When you started out in 2009, you were a member of the opposition, or your party was in opposition. So for 2 years, Fine Gael were not in government. 2011, Enda Kenny enters the Dáil, and you're a county councillor. Does that make any difference as a county councillor, the fact that you're a member of a party that is in government?
I would say no. But when I started on the council in 2009, we were actually in the majority. We were in the controlling group on Dunleary Rathdown. Fine Gael has always been the largest group in Dunleary Rathdown County Council. Today, as we go into these local elections, we have 13 out of the 40 councillors. And yet, in the current county council, we are actually not in the controlling group. So essentially, it was anybody but Fine Gael at the last election. The other groups came together to make sure that we weren't in control. But having control of the council then is a significant factor in getting things done. So, for example, if you can go to an official saying, I am part of this group of councillors that goes beyond Fine Gael, and we have decided we want to make this change, or we want this thing to happen, or whatever it is, that's obviously much more persuasive than if you're one councillor on your own, or if you're a member of a group that isn't part of the controlling group on the council. Now, you'd like to think officials listen to everyone, but the reality is that it is all about leverage. It is all about finding the sweet spot for the official as much as for the council. And I would say being in power only helps really when it comes to issues that the council has with central government. And at that point, you can potentially be an intermediary. But again, it depends, who's going to be in a single party government ever again? Probably no one. So it still depends on whether the Minister for Local Government or the Minister for Housing is going to be from your party. Do you have that person's ear? Do you have the relationship where you can make representations to the relevant minister, whatever it might be? That that's still in the balance, even if your party is in power. So I would say, actually, although people don't really realise that there is kind of a power negotiation of its own at local level as well, and that's more important than who's in government at any given time.
Can I go back? You certainly seem to suggest that you would like local government to have, elected councillors to have more power, but certainly in the past, the perception has been that the real corruption in politics is more at local level. And in Northern Ireland, which obviously has its own specific problems, there was an impression prior to civil rights that certain unionist-dominated councils had an awful lot of power to promote their own agenda, to put it mildly. And in the South, obviously, the Flood Mahon Tribunal indicated that brown envelopes were being passed and all that kind of thing. Is there a way of giving more power to elected local officials and avoid that danger of them being corrupted by that position?
Yes, there is. What you say is correct. As I said, there's a good reason why powers were taken away, but the local government landscape we have today is vastly different to what it was in the 1990s. First of all, there's a constitutional status for local government in Article 28A of the Constitution, which says that the state recognises the role of local government in providing a forum for the democratic representation of local communities. That is not being fulfilled at the moment, right, because those locally elected people don't have that. And in fact, most local councillors are essentially relegated to being local ambassadors to the chief executive, and that is not the way it's supposed to work. We have the weakest local government system in Europe, and we talk in European terms all the time about subsidiarity and bringing decision making to the lowest, most local possible level. But we don't practice that in Ireland. We have the most centralised system of any government.
Do I hear a constitutional challenge coming up?
Well, no, but I'm not going to take it anyway. But I do actually think it's important to recognise that. So I said the landscape is different. You first of all have a complete change, really, of the personnel elected all over the country. The attitude to anybody who's elected to the council on the 8th of June, the day after the poll this year, will be totally different. The people I worked with on the council are genuinely dedicated local servants. They're people who care about their communities, they're committed to their local communities, and that is very different to the kind of people you saw being described by the Flood and Mahon tribunals. It really is. Okay. Plus, if you look at the regulatory environment, SIPO is a massive change. Again, Fine Gael put it in place, but the Standards and Public Office Commission is a hugely important regulator on political activity, donations, activities, conflicts of interest, declarations of interest, assets, all that kind of thing. None of that was there in the 1990s. So can you trust councillors? I think you can, but I think you do so in the context that there is a much greater regulatory and supervisory environment in place than there was before. But more importantly than that, you should, because the whole idea is that they are there to represent communities, and they won't survive if they don't do that. The difficulty is that they're stymied statutorily at every turn when they try to do it, because all of the powers that they had are gone. Yeah. And they're now just making representations to a bunch of unelected officials who are never going to knock on your door and ask you what you need in the local community.
And how about directly elected mayors, somebody who's a sort of equal status to the chief executive you're talking about, somebody who's directly elected, who is the symbol, whether symbolic or with actual power, to where you get one person who effectively is standing up and saying, I represent Dunleary, Tralee, wherever it is.
Well, we're going to see how that works out in Limerick as we look at the first mayoral election there on the 7th of June. I have no difficulty with the concept of a directly elected mayor. As long as the powers are vested in somebody who is democratically elected, I think it's a good thing. The difficulty that arises, and this is something I've been critical of, first of all, you said equal to the chief executive. The person needs to be above the chief executive. In Limerick, you have a situation where the chief executive has actually been compensated for the fact that he is losing power. He's getting an increase in his salary, even though he has less responsibility. That's not the way it's supposed to be.
Doesn't sound ideal.
It doesn't, no. And so if you have a directly elected mayor, great. But you must also look at how that's creating another layer of bureaucracy in local government. It can work, but I don't know that we've yet put in place the systems that will make sure it does work.
Can I ask you about that, Barry? In Limerick, it was by a whisker that the public voted for an elected mayor. There was a plebiscite as such, and people were able to vote and decide whether they wanted a directly elected mayor, and Limerick voted for it. And I think the Twittering classes would have thought that people would be delighted to have an elected mayor, and they would have thought this is more power for their area and more control for their area and stuff. And yet referendums on introducing an elected mayor in Cork, defeated. Waterford, defeated. Why is that?
Dublin. We didn't have a referendum, but we had a colloquium of the 4 local authorities who was slimly defeated by that group as well.
So what's going on there?
I think the issue with that is not that people are opposed to a directly elected mayor, because the idea of having a supreme democratic figure who has the actual power to pursue an agenda over a 5-year period, and remember the Garhirlig or the mayors of different local authorities are only ever there for 1 year at a time, so they have no chance to build up momentum or to actually achieve a programme that requires the kind of length of time that 5 years would allow. I think people are in favour of that. But if you say we're going to have a directly elected mayor of Cork, for example, what happens to the Cork? First of all, you've got 2 local authorities in Cork. You've got the City Council and the County Council. What happens to all those councillors? What happens to their powers? Are they now subjugated, to the power of the directly elected mayor? How do they approve projects, or what role do they have? And I think there is a concern amongst people that, again, that subsidiarity point will be dismissed. So in Dublin, for example, again, and this would be true of any large county, the difference between somebody who lives in, let's say, the city centre, to somebody who lives in the mountains in Kiltiernan, to somebody who lives in rural North Dublin, to somebody who lives in Dalkey, all of their issues and issues are going to be very, very different. That's why you have councillors locally. Now, I think there are too many councillors. So in Dublin, you've got 183 councillors. I would much rather see a situation where you have a massively reduced number of councillors, but properly resourced, properly paid, full-time people with actual resources, secretarial assistants, for example. Because at the moment, you have a situation where it is so difficult to be a councillor on a part-time basis that fewer and fewer people can do it, which means that the people who are becoming councillors have to be retired or independently wealthy or supported by a spouse or whatever it might be. And that's, again, not the way the local government is supposed to work.
Or they're just promoting their own political ambitions because they want to go up to the next stage.
Yeah, I can't criticise anyone for that. I don't think that's illegitimate.
Well, there's plenty of people out there who actually want to be councillors. Dermot Lacey, for example, always famously said, I only ever want to be a councillor. Love to be an elected mayor of Dublin, if that was to happen, I think, down the line. But people like him, and there's long-serving councillors
and colleagues of mine in Dún Laoghaire who want to serve their areas. And as I said, councillors are almost like, when I think of my colleagues around the country from Fine Gael anyway, because they're the ones I know best, they are dedicated local servants. They're people who want to benefit their local community. Of course, there are some amongst them who wish to progress, and I genuinely wouldn't criticise any of them for it. But there are many who don't, many who just want to get certain things done for their area. And those people are the best kind of politician we have.
Yep. I think it's wonderful. We've an election at the moment, Barry, and obviously that's why we're talking about this topic. But it is wonderful to see so many people up on the polls of Dublin and throughout the country, all over the country, running for election. And we hear stories all the time. I mean, it is horrific for politicians out there. Social media, you probably know all about it. And I'm sure it is very, very challenging. But isn't it great so many people still want to go for it? And I think people still really want to go for it, despite all the negativity and all the, I'd never do that. A lot of people still want to do it.
They do. Although what you definitely see in the last number of years is fewer people stick at it. Having done 5 years as a councillor, you realise how hard it is. And I talk about resources, for example. In the last 5 years, they have slightly varied the paying conditions of councillors, but you could not live in Dublin, certainly not in Dún Laoghaire at Down, on a councillor's salary. It's not something you can do.
And a lot of people stepping back for other reasons and letting other people take their place.
Exactly. And you mentioned, for example, Peter, the abuse that they receive. Again, that depends on the area, depends on the party. There's a lot of variables involved there, but the threats, the abuse on social media, that's very unpleasant. And a lot of people who have options, who can do just as well elsewhere and better elsewhere, and certainly can make more money elsewhere, would just go, well, why would I continue at this? Sure. But I agree with you. I think it is great. As you drive around Dublin, around the rest of the country, there are posters going up, and there are those who will say that we should ban posters, for example, and I understand why they're saying that, but it's important to remember that for first-time candidates, people who don't have the benefit of incumbency, a poster is a hugely important tool for getting their name out there. And I know myself from speaking to people, they don't know there's an election until the posters go up. And it's a wonderful pageantry, but again, important to remember that there are really strict rules around littering, so those posters come down within 7 days of polling day, and if they don't, there are significant fines.
And in terms of local elections and European elections, they're fixed terms every 5 years. So if you have 3 weeks of posters every 5 years, is that so bad?
I don't think so.
No, I don't think so.
I must say, I love it. Now, obviously, I'm a politician, so be it. But I think it's a wonderful way. And the great thing I love about elections, of whatever level they are, when you go into the polling station, everyone's equal.
Yeah.
Nobody is more important or more significant. Everybody's vote counts the same. And there's a wonderful equality on polling day when you're in the polling station with your neighbours and your friends and the people you know from around the area, and you're all having your say at exactly the same level.
Well, Barry, this will be, sorry, one more, Mark, but this will be your first election since 2009 that you're kind of sitting out, first council election.
Absolutely,
but maybe you might get a little outing later in the year. Can you tell us anything about that?
Well, I can't, unfortunately, because nobody tells me these things. I don't think it'll be this year myself.
Okay.
Like Simon Harris has made it very clear it'll be next year. I think that is the right thing to do. Before he became leader of Fine Gael and Taoiseach, I would have said it would have been October. And in fact, my clear publicly stated view was that if we wait until after the clocks changed, it was too late because you're into a winter election then. And I actually don't think anybody wants that. The latest date, by my calculations, of which it can happen is the 22nd of March. So I don't know if it'll go that far, but I think it will be next year.
Can I, just going back to, you talked a little bit about, you think there should be fewer councillors with better resourced. Have you looked at the practice in other European countries? Are there other countries where local government really works, where they're properly accountable to the people, where they have powers that work? I mean, we hear about Swiss cantonals and that kind of thing, but are there other EU countries that we should be looking at?
Every other EU country we should be looking at. As I said, we have the weakest local government system of any of our European neighbours. When I was a councillor, set up a twinning arrangement between Blackrock and Vincennes, which is a suburb in Paris. When we deal with Vincennes, they can do so much and they have greater responsibility. They look after school, health facilities. If subsidiarity is good enough for us at a European level, it's good enough for us at a local level as well. Okay. And we should be giving more powers to the people at local level.
Okay. We have one question that we always ask our listeners. I expect you've been looking through your bookshelves and your DVD collection. Is there a book or film that you would like to recommend to our listeners? It doesn't have to be a legal book.
In fairness, and I've heard you asking other interviewees on the podcast, and I meant to do it, but I didn't. I will say this. I'm a huge fan of Robert Harris. Yeah. He's a kind of historical fiction. He does both that historical fiction. If you read something like Pompeii, his book about the Piscina Mirabilis, that's fed the water to the people of Pompeii. That kind of telling the story of an ordinary person, an unremarkable person. In that case, it's the engineer of the Piscina Mirabilis. I think I love the detail that comes with that and his historical knowledge. But he also runs a lot of what-if narratives as well, projecting a possible scenario. Fatherland is another one, which is set in Berlin in 1989, in a scenario where Germany won the Second World War. I love his writing. I think he has a fabulous, detailed knowledge of all of the aspects of what he's doing, and the research is plain. And it's very slow and detailed. That sounds like I'm doing it down, but it's almost introspective in the detail that it goes into. So yeah, I love Robert Harris.
If I could put in a shout for his book on the Dreyfus Affair, An Officer and a Spy.
An Officer and a Spy.
Really one
fabulous.
of the best books I've ever read.
It's really good, and I love his stuff. I just finished V2, actually, a little bit behind the curve, but he has another one coming out in August as well, and I love his stuff, and I love that opportunity to delve into a really small part of history, but in such a detailed way that you can actually feel what it was like to be there at that time.
Fantastic. So Barry, thank you very much for joining us here in the Fifth Court.
The Fifth Court will adjourn until next week.
So that's all from this edition of The Fifth Court. We hope you have enjoyed it. Can I say a huge thank you to Barrister and Senator Barry Ward for coming in and explaining the realities of local government and the abilities, I suppose, and powers of councillors to influence matters. Mark, that was a really good interview.
Well, what I found particularly interesting, I mean, I'm always concerned when you hear people discussing Irish problems as if they've never happened in this country, in any other country, that they're unique to us. And there's Barry, he says, basically, we have the weakest elected local officials of anywhere in Europe, that basically you take any other country in Europe and you have better accountability to the local population. And I think that's interesting. I mean, clearly, reforming local government is a big deal, but I think he certainly put forward a very good argument for it.
Yeah, and I mean, I made the point about all these councillors and candidates out there, and we can see them on the lampposts around the country and wherever they're advertising. And you know what? People are putting themselves forward. It is a very important role. I think Barry has explained that brilliantly. So get out and vote. Isn't that it? Get
Absolutely.
out and vote. I think it's just really, really important. Okay, so before we go, I would also like to say a big thank you to our producer, Conal O'Moroyne, and to Alison O'Dwyer, who has done such a wonderful job in recording this podcast for us. Thank you, Alison. So for me, Peter Leonard.
And myself, Mark Tottenham.
Thank you for listening, and we'll see you soon in the Fifth Court.